Okay, so this is my presentation for project-based learning. So project-based learning is personalized learning. And I thought that quote really summarized what these 3 chapters were about. So first, for chapter 3, a little rundown. It's a setup to project-based learning and an explanation of the why behind project-based learning. So for chapter 3, it is called Imagining the Possibilities. So first, you need to identify what's most important. So you need to find the big idea in the lesson, and projects should be complete learning experiences. They shouldn't just focus on one avenue. The goal is to be project-based and then to use the textbooks as supplementary information, not the other way around. And so how do you find the big idea? So you want to reflect and focus on the why of a lesson. So an example they gave was a teacher allowed students to write articles that were submitted to be published in the newspaper about fishing and things like that, because that's what was big in their town. And so, you want them to be able to relate that back to their real life. It should overlap many disciplines. It shouldn't only focus on one content area. And you want to come up with problems that solve real-world issues. So an example that I thought of was in college. I was a public relations major, and for all of our projects, we dealt with real-world clients. So we dealt with nonprofits or companies in the area that we could help solve their issues and their struggles with. So it made the projects more meaningful, and it made us want to work harder and give more effort because it was going to impact other people. You want to analyze, evaluate, and create, and that's from Bloom's taxonomy. So you want to, dive deeper into that. And then you want true to life projects that must involve technology, since technology is such a huge part of our culture today, the job market, the students' lives. You want to include that as much as possible, and not just, slideshows, but YouTube videos, podcasts, things like that. And experiences are what end up developing learning dispositions. So this is where they talked about the fixed versus growth mindset. So a fixed mindset is someone who thinks that their own ability, so if they think something's too hard, they're not going to push past it because they don't think that they can actually do it. And the growth mindset is you can do it, it just is more focused on the effort behind your work. And so an example for how to combat these mindsets were to include like a reflection component at the end of the projects to allow students to critique their challenges and express their successes. So it allows teachers to see, where students might have fallen short, but why that also happened. So kind of the why behind it. And then, as always, you want to teach for your students. You want to make projects that are relevant to them, things that they're interested in, not necessarily things based on a textbook or what a textbook is telling them they need to know. So chapter 4, the rundown for this, it's a focus on developing and adapting projects and how to create a basic project idea. Chapter 4 is called Strategies for Discovery. So first it talks about reviewing existing projects. So caveat emptor is let the buyer beware. So if you're going to use existing projects, you need to be very careful of what you're doing and how you look into it. You want to be as selective as possible, but it's also a good idea to review the projects that are already available to you, even if you decide to create your own. So that could be reviewing the web or talking to other teachers at your school or, other teachers in different districts, just trying to get ideas of how to best create a project. So next, it talks about the potential pitfalls. So long activity, short on learning outcomes. So this is where you have them do something super long and crazy, but they're not getting anything out of it. And then next is technology layered over traditional practice. So that could be, them doing a writing project where they have to research a certain time period and then they put together a slideshow. Well, that's the same thing as having them look through a textbook and then write a paper about it, but just, adding technology. So it's not really adding any value, you're just adding more work. You don't want to do trivial thematic units. they're a little bit difficult with project-based learning because they are too broad. They don't dive deep enough, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You don't want it to be overly scripted with too many steps, because if it gets too specific, students don't really have the freedom to go down their own learning paths and focus on things that really interest them. There's sometimes not enough focus on formative assessment with projects that already exist. And then assessment doesn't necessarily feel authentic because it's not focused on the students and focused on their strengths. It's just focused on the project itself. And then designing terrific projects, how to get started. So first you want to develop a flexible framework, and then an example that they gave in the book kind of goes back to the trivial thematic units and how to combat that. Teachers were doing a theme on oceans, but then they noticed their students were really interested in building boats with blocks. So they changed their project to be, how are boats made or how are boats built, things like that. So oceans was still the broad theme, but they focused it down into boats. They made that more specific, but it made students dive deeper into that one area and not necessarily trying to do surface level of the whole ocean. And you want to set up projects that force students to ask questions, and projects that have students believe it's important to them, things that matter and things that are worthy of them investing their time in. You want to have your projects ask open-ended questions. So an example was teachers were doing a lesson on politics and the election, and they had their students create their own political parties and then present their views on a YouTube channel. So this had students researching all types of political parties, every viewpoint and things like that they had, rather than just focusing on one party. So it really led students to, ask why questions or just dive deeper. And then the best projects share important features. They're loosely designed with different learning paths. They center on a driving question. They're realistic and cover multiple disciplines. And there's many other important features, but I don't really have time to go into all of that now. And then chapter 5, the rundown, it's all about assessment. So your assessments should be a natural process. It should naturally flow from the beginning to the end. So it shouldn't seem just like an assessment that's pasted on at the end just for assessment purposes. And your approach to assessment should be intentional. So it shouldn't be just, an afterthought. Chapter 5 is called Making Assessment Meaningful. So in order to have authentic assessment in project-based learning, you want to move away from national tests and towards assessments that are developed by your communities. So your community is, your teachers in your grade level, teachers in the whole school, teachers in the district, parents, students. You want it to be a collaborative effort and things that are relevant to you. So assessment for learning, there are 2 different kinds of assessment that the book outlines. So assessment for learning and assessment of learning. So assessment for learning, you want to assess along the way using checkpoints. And this is called formative assessment. So this allows teachers to make adjustments in the project as needed based on, if students are focusing on one certain area instead of another, well, then you can switch it up and change it, but it also allows you to push students further. And then assessment of learning, the 2 main assessment purposes in this part are to measure learning and evaluate the quality of the project. So you want to assess at the end of a project based on a rubric or tests or other ways, and that's called summative assessment. So first we'll talk about summative assessment. Summative assessment is what you want to start with because this will frame your whole project. So this is the objectives of the project, what you want students to learn, what you want them to gain from the project. So this should be your first point when creating a project. And 3 things that the book identified were objectives, evidence, and activities. So you want to start with objectives, move to evidence, and then to activities, and each of these should be intertwined and flow seamlessly from one to another. And teachers can use school-wide rubrics and adjust them based on their learning objective, or they could create their own rubric. And then for formative assessment, this allows teachers to guide students' efforts. So if you see them, struggling in a certain area, you can help them at a certain point and push them further instead of waiting to the end and saying, oh, well, you could have done this here that could have helped you all the way at the end. You want to just assess as you go all the way through. And then it's important to create a project timeline. So you want to set milestones and plan for check-ins all the way through. And you want to give important and meaningful feedback and critiques to the students throughout the way. So that was a quick run through of chapters 3, 4, and 5 on project-based learning, but I hope it was helpful to you. Thanks.